Welcome to our 47th episode of In Conversation with Convergence. My name is George Evans, and this is a monthly podcast where we feature our clients and very special guests. We help you get to know the market leaders and some of the top issues facing the industry. I am joined today by Nikki Pirrello, and Nikki is president and publisher of Pension and Investments. And I think, if I read it right, Nikki, I think you're there for a little over 18 years-ish, if I've got that right. So I believe, but listen, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, George. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to chatting with you about what's going on in the market and talking a little bit about P&I. I have been here for almost 18 years, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, well, it seems like a lifetime, right? I'm sure. But
Yes.
so why don't we start with kind of right? Your background, your pedigree, and kind of what you did and kind of how you arrived at P&I. I think that's an interesting story.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, so I mean, I think it has been a non-traditional journey coming over to pensions and investments. So I grew up and I went to school in the Midwest, and I had always wanted to move to New York and work in publishing. So I decided to do that a couple years after graduating college. I literally just rented a writer truck, drove to New York, picked up and moved with the hopes of finding a job in publishing. I started out, and my first publishing job was actually at Scholastic, which is, certainly very different than P&I. It's a children's publishing company. I was there during the Harry Potter heyday, so it was a lot of fun. Really great place to learn a lot about the business. And then I moved to another business-to-business publisher, which is LeVar Friedman, which specialized in primarily restaurant, retail, and pharmaceutical. And then I came to pensions and investments, as I said, about 18 years ago, and was initially recruited in by our former publisher, Chris Battaglia, to grow the global conference business. So I started out really running the conference team and scaling that business for them. I will confess, when I first joined pensions and investments, I did not expect to spend a career here. I knew
Yeah.
nothing about pensions or really the investment market. My background obviously was media, publishing, and marketing. So it has been a really incredible learning journey. And I've really grown to love the industry and the market that we serve.
Yeah, well, I listen. I can tell you because I've been to a number of P&I events over the years. You are the icon associated with P&I now in the market. So, tell us about P&I, right? I know very little other than
Yeah.
it's part of the Crane family, but I'd like to hear a bit about uh, the whole, the enterprise, really.
Yeah, thanks. So, as you noted, we're part of Crane Communications, which is still a 100% family-owned publishing company that's nearly 110 years old.
Huh.
So, a pretty incredible, storied history. The third generation of the Crane family is actually running the company now, and P&I was established organically within the group in 1973, really aligned with ERISA rolling out. So when ERISA was getting ready to pass, they realized that this was a market that was likely poised for continued growth in the US and had great foresight, and pensions and investments was born. Um, for those who don't know us well, we are really a publication focused on the institutional investing market. So we serve institutional investors and the global asset managers who serve them on a global basis, really covering pension funds, both DB and DC, endowments and foundations, and sovereign wealth funds. We have a multi-channel approach to serving this market. With dedicated daily news coverage, and we have an editorial team of about 30, which I think for a highly specialized business to business publication is really rare these days. So we have a really senior team with a wide range of people out there really reporting on what's happening on a day-to-day basis. We're also well known for our in-depth special reports. So we have proprietary data that we've been collecting in many cases for 50 plus years
Yeah.
on the largest US retirement plans, the largest asset managers, largest consultants, and a lot of really great special reports. That data feeds our research center, which is a separate product, our research and data center from our everyday news product. And we still have a monthly print publication, which the industry has asked us to keep going. People
Yeah.
still really value the print. They read the print publication every month. And then we say the news is really via our website and our array of newsletters. So you can receive the daily news through those products. And then, as you mentioned, we also do have a robust conference and webinar business hosting 12 to 15 events over the course of the year, both in the US, Canada, and Europe.
Yeah, well, by the way, I'm still one of those guys who gets the hard copy, and actually,
That's great.
I don't think every day I start with P and my day starts with a coffee and a quick glance at P and I online, right? And
Great.
I take your point though about collecting data though for 50 years that the
Yeah.
power of time series, let's just call it that, which
Yeah.
Convergence, we know that well, right? That's enabled us to do all kinds of AI and build all kinds of algorithms and do all kinds of predictive
Right.
stuff because time series, right, to your point, is really really powerful data, right, that a lot of people don't have, right? um,
Yes.
so I want to start with 2025, and it has seemed like it's been a long year already, and it's only right towards the end of March. But um, I wanted you to kind of, some people could say it's almost a crazy start to the year, right? That a lot of politics, a lot of volatility in the markets. Just want to get kind of a view from you when I kind of glanced at a few recent P and I uh, hard copies. Just said, "Oh my gosh, I could talk to Nikki for hours. There's so many topics in here." But let's kind of start with just the start to this year from your perspective and the politics and the volatility.
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up really well. It's definitely been a wild start to the year. I think politically, the unknowns in Washington, D.C. are driving a lot of volatility in the markets, and the challenges that we're seeing across the legal and regulatory landscape really means unpredictability, which makes it really hard for investors to make decisions. So, we're hearing from allocators sort of across the spectrum that it's hard for them to make major changes to their portfolio and their asset allocation when there's so much uncertainty going on in the markets, both from how the markets are reacting, but also not really knowing what's coming down the pike in the legal and regulatory landscape. And similarly, I would say, for defined contribution plan sponsors specifically, we're hearing that some of them are feeling sort of stuck right now as litigation concerns drive so many of the decisions that they make in that space. And certainly it's something that we're seeing in our engagement with the publication. To your point, is some of our top content this year thus far has been around the regulatory issues and policy developments, especially in the wake of the Trump administration and the changes of regulatory agencies like the SEC, the DOL, and EBSA, which all impact obviously the institutional allocators in our market. So interesting times. It gives people a lot to talk about, but I think it makes it really challenging for people to make decisions about their investment portfolios with
What do
everything
you
that's
think
going on.
allocators are kind of just pausing a little bit to just kind of try to read what the heck they think is going to go on? I mean, what are you hearing or seeing? Because you kind of tap that market, better than anybody. The sponsor side.
So I think a lot of them are, sort of pausing, taking a little bit of a wait and see mode where they can. I mean, look, if they had changes already in place with regards to their asset allocation. They may be proceeding with those, but I don't know that people are really looking to make any major changes right now. I would say maybe some exceptions that we're seeing to that would be across the endowment and foundation market, given some of what's happening with political backlash with universities and endowments right now. I think we are seeing some of those big institutional investors think a little bit differently about what's in their portfolios, maybe even keeping a higher allocation to cash
Yeah.
at this time because they're not certain what's going to happen with some of their government funding at this point. So I think in my experience and from the conversations we're having right now, they're definitely looking at the market a little bit differently
Yeah.
than obviously the big pension investors.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think there's kind of a fair amount of unpredictability right now. Now, you're probably happy if you're a hedge fund trader right now, right? But other than that, it's pretty volatile. Well, what do you just a little deeper thought on just the legal and regulatory landscape? Like, if you had a comment about the SEC, right now, I would say, my opinion is. People really waiting to see now again, like kind of what kind of framework the SEC is going to kind of really look at in 25, 26 and beyond. Do you hear anything more definitive than that about, say, the SEC?
No, I think it's still too early, really. So again, we go back to that sort of uncertainty that I think people are in wait and see mode. Certainly, the theme that we're hearing is people assume that we're moving towards more deregulation and a lighter regulatory environment,
All
but
right.
it's really hard to see how that's going to play out. And with them still finalizing the nominees and the actual approvals for some of these leading roles, I think it's hard to tell right now what direction some of these folks are going to go because some of them aren't necessarily really prominent people. And so there's a lot of speculation right
Yeah.
now on where things are going to go.
Well, it's an interesting swing and turn of events because I think 2024 was maybe the biggest SEC agenda people ever saw with like 50
Yeah.
different right engagements and rules and changes. And now I don't think people have a very firm punch list of what's the SEC's agenda. I think it's, to your point, a little early and a little wait and see. I want to move to another topic, and I'll be interested in your thoughts on ESG and DEI right now. And obviously, a lot of backlash, right? I'll call it that. But kind of what's your read, Nikki, on how that's kind of playing out right now?
So it's super interesting. The ESG piece has been going on a little bit longer. I think the DEI piece is a little bit more recent, but obviously there are some ways that they're connected. And again, I would say this is an area where we're seeing really strong engagement from our readers. We're publishing a lot on what's going on in this space right now, and people are, really consuming that content at a very high rate. On the ESG front, I think some of the big challenges are that, most of our investors are global investors and most of the asset managers are global asset managers. And right now, the US is very different from an ESG perspective than most of the rest of the world, and certainly than Europe and Canada, which are other really large institutional markets, and even Australia, which has a huge DC superannuation system. And I think all of those countries view ESG very differently than
Yes.
we have in the US most recently. And so a lot of what we're hearing now are those challenges that we're hearing from people who have global portfolios about how you have to think about this across different markets. We know obviously some of the big public funds like CalPERS continue to be very vocal about the fact that they believe that climate risk and ESG factors are hugely important in terms of how they view their portfolios. But then alternatively, you have a lot of the major asset managers who are now pulling back on ESG and cutting ties with investor-led climate coalitions like the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and Climate Action 100. So it's a strange balancing act
Yeah.
right now. I would say, from what I've seen, I don't know that people are really changing their approach to how they evaluate risk and manage portfolios so much as they're changing the nomenclature that they're using around that from an ESG front. On the DEI side, I think it will be really interesting to see how this plays out over the long term. It seemed like initially people were just going to sort of keep quiet, but now we're seeing very quickly a lot of big firms rolling out stating that they are changing their DEI lens or approach, and in many instances, even changing the titles of people within their team that are DEI related. It's still really, really early on this one, so that I don't really have a sense for what this is going to mean over the long term. But if I'm being fully honest, just personally, I've been a bit surprised to see the reactions when it comes specifically to the DEI piece, knowing all of the research and the work that's been done over the past several years to really talk about how diversity of viewpoints and diversity across investment teams leads to better outcomes and better results typically. So it feels to me like there is still a case to be made when you look at the stats and data. But I think right now the reactions are coming perhaps a little bit more from a qualitative lens as opposed to a quantitative lens.
Yeah. I think it's well said. I think there's this flurry coming out of Washington right now, and I think
Yeah.
the political winds are very strong on this topic, and I think they'll settle down a bit because I think, and maybe it's going to get tempered a bit, but I still believe personally too that DEI is important, and I think it will carry on, and it may be adjusted and tempered. But I think once the dust settles a little bit in Washington, although there's a lot of people who don't think the dust will ever settle for 4 more years, but if it
Yeah.
does, right, I do think it'll find its due course, and but I guess it's a very if you think about everything we've talked about so far, there's kind of one common theme, right? It's uncertainty, right? There's a lot
Yeah.
of it, right? So I think a lot remains to be seen, right? And I think um, there's a lot of good things that come out of both ESG and DEI that hopefully are,
Yeah.
preserved, right? So
Yeah.
we'll see. Um, let's talk about one other topic in the 25 marketplace is just some of the convergence you're seeing around retirement and wealth. You know, you may have called it the silver tsunami, right? Talk a little bit
Yeah.
about what you're seeing, Nikki. I think our listeners would be very interested in that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is another trend that's been playing out over several years, but again, I think that it has accelerated certainly more recently. And so, I was telling somebody the other day, I think I hear the term convergence or co-opetition almost daily now. And it really has to do with how the sort of retirement, wealth, and record keeping businesses are coming together and what that really means for those businesses, and in many ways, how that impacts sort of the future of the defined contribution ecosystem. And I think what we're seeing now is that that's really evolving more rapidly than we're used to in this market. We're not known for moving quickly, typically. And a lot of that, to the point you noted, is driven by this the sort of the silver tsunami. So the fact that the 401k market is slated to grow significantly over the next 5 years. We've already seen tremendous growth in the past 5 years. Some of this is due to legislative mandates by many of the states that are now implementing DC plans to expand coverage, which is really great. But that aligns with also then hitting peak 65, meaning that 2024 was a record-breaking year for retirement in the US, with about 11,000 Americans a day celebrating their 65th birthdays. And about 4.1 million Americans are poised to turn 65 every year through 2027. So this is the largest surge of retirement age Americans in history. I think, tying back to sort of the legal and regulatory piece we were talking about, Secure 2.0 also may have helped accelerate this trend of convergence, because it has really allowed defined contribution plan sponsors and their partners in this to implement a broader set of services. So we hear a lot more plan sponsors now talking about student debt, emergency savings, how HSAs work with their 401ks, and a much more holistic view on financial well-being. And I think the Secure 2.0 legislation really sort of cleared space for them to actually implement a lot more of these programs. And so as we see implementation happening, you're sort of figuring out how all of these partners work together. And I think as part of that initiative, what we're seeing is the distinction between workplace retirement savings and personal wealth is really blurring. And so you're really starting to see this collaboration, but it also, as I said, means sort of co-opetition and convergence as each of the different players in the industry, the record keepers, the defined contribution plan sponsors, and those retirement plan advisors and wealth advisors sort of figure out what their lane is here.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the biggest and most sophisticated kind of are seeing the writing on the wall, right? And are I'm impressed with those numbers. I didn't realize there were 4 million a year, which is probably why every other article I read is about what's going to happen to Social Security, right? And that's a whole nother topic, right? Let's talk about a few last things, and one is just private credit. I want to start there, right? It is as interesting a topic as I've seen in a long time. I mean, just the pure expansion of private credit, the velocity of that right now is nothing like I've ever seen. In fact, when we Convergence, we do a lot of work looking at fund launches and new capital, and just the amount of private equity, private credit activity is through the roof right now. Your thoughts on that, on private credit right now in the market?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think again, another area for us where there's not only a lot of coverage, but we see great engagement with our raters is covering private credit, and whether that's asset allocators who are increasing their allocation to private credit. I think we're also seeing sort of deeper dives on the different strategies within private credit, and asset allocators are really starting, I think, to learn much more about the different opportunities there. And then, basically every asset manager at this juncture is either building or buying a private credit operation, it seems. So we know it's one of the fastest growing areas of the financial system over the past 15 years, really since the great financial crisis. and has become an increasing part of institutional portfolios. I think Moody's estimates that this could be a $3 trillion market by 2028. And our head of research and data was telling me that US public DB plans specifically have loaded up on private credit and infrastructure over the last 10 years or so. And private credit investments within public DB plans has soared almost $170 billion
Wow. Yeah.
since 2016. And again, that's just in public DB plans institutionally. So it's pretty incredible to see. I think there's a lot of factors driving it. Since the global financial crisis, with sources of capital seeking different ways to get lines of credit, and then you've got, I said, a lot of institutional and at this point even some retail products and also major insurers that are looking for ways to diversify capital and expand into private credit. So I don't really see this as a trend that's going to slow down
No.
in the next several years. But you said it's been really interesting to see. And I think one of the things we have noted is that institutional allocators overall seem to be, I think, much more sophisticated now about how they're thinking about those private credit allocations and sort of the different flavors of it that they're looking at integrating into their portfolios.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that's really well said, and I think it's been a boom for the whole ecosystem, whether you're
Yeah.
a law firm or a service provider, like the fund administrators, for example, got to figure out how to service this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So it's been a huge topic for the investor, the service providers, the regulatory community, but it is, I agree with you, it is far from a passing fad. I think this is a major investment and asset type going forward. Let me go to one other topic, and then I do want to just finish with kind of what you're seeing in the P&I research, right, world, kind of the trends. But I want to always keep us at this certain minute mark, because I find after doing 47 of these, our listeners have an attention span of about what we're going to hit, right? I want to talk
Perfect.
about the democratization of private assets and, people integrating alts, right? Never, uh, I shouldn't say never, but it's hard to believe that we're not far away from you and I picking a hedge fund or a structured asset
Yeah.
fund or a private credit fund and putting it in our 401k, right? And talk a little bit about what you're seeing, what you're hearing, maybe what are some of the opportunities, what are some of the challenges maybe you think exist with the whole democratization topic.
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think the reality is at this juncture, it's inevitable. We're going to see alts integrated into DC plans, and I know that we're already actually starting to see some structures that are being put together and will be rolling out to market really, really soon. I think that people I talk to and a lot of the research I've read, the agreement is that this is something that is really necessary. There are so many more private companies now than there are public companies. Access to the S&P 500 and the public markets now just doesn't offer the diversification that it once did. So I think that it makes a lot of sense to integrate alternatives into defined contribution plans. And like I said, we know that overarchingly the industry is behind this.
Yes.
I think, to your point, what I am hearing though is that this will really be as part of a multi-asset portfolio. So to your point, I don't think we're going to see many DC plan sponsors who are offering standalone alternatives allocations for people who are building their own portfolios to choose from, because there's a lot of risk in that. But if these are packaged inside a multi-asset portfolio, like a managed account or a target date fund, then you have that opportunity to, sort of create smoothing and to create a product where there are much fewer concerns about illiquidity, and hopefully still the ability for those investors in defined contribution plans to get that illiquidity premium. It also makes sense because if they create products for the market, look, there's 3.5 trillion in target date assets now, and that's just slated to continue to grow. So building products specifically for that type of a fund structure, I think is certainly how we're going to see this start, at least in the early days,
Yeah.
with regards to integrating alternatives into DC. And I think it's similar to what we're even seeing with some of the retail structures that are being built now.
Yeah. I mean, and listen, some of the biggest alternative managers are, and I won't mention names, but they are off to the races on this topic, right? And the big,
Yes.
there's a whole view here that, and I'd be quickly interested in your view on this, right? One of the things that we care a lot about is investor protection, right, and the safety of the investor, right? And I think that's going to be um, that's going to resurface with alternatives because the in some cases not as much that regulatory overhang exists that always
Yeah.
did, right, with traditional. Just quick thought on investor protection, Nikki.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's the huge concern. These are often complicated products, complicated structures. And so for most lay investors, whether they be those in defined contribution plans or even most retail investors, they truly don't understand the products. I do think that's why creating structures where there is some protection, if you will, i.e., a sleeve within a target date fund, is likely to be the right approach. And then I think, honestly, it's going to be a little bit of a wait and see. Can they really deliver within maybe a more confined structure that outperformance that would be the reason for integrating them into the plans to begin with, so that people have the opportunity for better growth over time with their assets. And so, that we'll have to see how it proves out. But I think that's critically important. And I think, honestly, that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen alternatives integrated into defined contributions before now broadly. We've seen a
Yeah.
few dip their toes into the water. And again, you go back to the litigation issues are real, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to protecting the end
Correct.
investor and really trying to ensure that we're driving the best outcomes.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. All right, lastly, I know we talked about a lot of things. Any one or two things going on in the P&I Research Center that we didn't talk about that might be interesting to our listeners?
Yeah, so I thought it might actually just be fun to end with a few fun facts that my research center director pulled together for us around the alternative space overall. So I know I
Okay.
hit on many of the trends that our readers are engaging with regards to our overall content, but I thought it would be fun to talk about US corporate DB plans, having long allocated to alternatives over the past 20 years, have grown from that being 9% of their portfolios to 26%.
Wow.
In that same 20-year period, public DB plans have gone from a 2.5% allocation in alternatives to 34%
Wow.
of their total
I would have never
portfolios on
guessed that high.
average,
Yeah.
which is really incredible.
Yeah.
And then, we talked a little bit about that private credit trend and seeing, really phenomenal growth there over the last 9 or 10 years as well. Similarly, we're actually seeing some strong growth on the venture capital side, again, primarily with US public plans. But we saw annual commitments over the last 5 years at about 5.4 billion. So still a very small piece of their portfolio, but that compares with just about 1.8 billion the prior 5 years. So just really interesting to see how some of these shifts are coming together, I think, and the continued importance of alternatives as part of most institutional portfolios.
Yeah, no, those are really interesting facts. So, and the growth is, I knew there was growth, but I didn't think it was that kind of growth. So,
It's pretty incredible.
yeah, it really is. Well,
Yeah.
listen, I just want to thank you for being a fantastic guest. I really was looking forward to you joining us today, and thought it was a great conversation. And I'm very appreciative of all the hard work you and P and I do, because you provide a lot of great um, insights and topics to the industry. So thank you, and thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and allowing me to talk a little bit about the work that the team is doing at P&I. And it always warms my heart to hear that it's providing value out into the
Well,
industry.
it
So
definitely
thanks,
is.
George.
So it's part of my daily routine, right? So it's terrific.
Fantastic.
So listen, thank you,
Right.
Nikki. Thanks
Thanks.
very much.